One of the greatest perks of my job is the opportunity to travel all over. My work has taken me to some of the most breathtaking destinations around the world, from the historic ruins of Greece to the scenic coastlines of Italy. But most of the time, my business trips are much more local, keeping me right here within the borders of the United States. A few years ago, my job required me to travel to a rugged, mountainous region in the northeastern part of the country called the Adirondacks. If you have ever been to this area, then you know exactly what I mean when I say it is absolutely spectacular in the autumn. The leaves change into these brilliant, vibrant shades of red, orange, and yellow. It genuinely makes the entire mountain range look like something out of a classic fairy tale. It is just incredible. Normally, my company is more than happy to pay for a standard hotel room, but for this specific trip, I wanted to do something a little different. I was feeling a bit burnt out and really wanted some much-needed alone time. I thought staying deep in the mountains would be the perfect way to unwind. And so, instead of booking a generic hotel, I hopped onto Airbnb to look for a secluded mountain home. After scrolling for a bit, I found the absolute perfect place. It was a beautiful wooden home nestled deep within a thick grove of trees. The best part was the back deck, which had an incredible, uninterrupted view looking right down the side of a mountain. This place felt like a dream come true. It was exactly what I was looking for. There were also a few quiet trails right by the property where I could go for my morning jogs. The privacy was unmatched, and I could already picture myself sitting out on that deck, sipping a hot drink, and just soaking in the natural beauty. For obvious privacy and legal reasons, I am not going to reveal the name of the woman who hosted this property. My work obligations for this trip were actually very light. I only had to attend meetings in the late afternoons and early evenings, which meant I would have the vast majority of the day to just relax at the cabin. I finally arrived at the house late on Friday evening. The sun was already setting, so I did not do much of anything that night. I just poured myself a drink, sat out on the deck for a bit to enjoy the crisp mountain air, and then decided to call it an early night. I woke up around 6 o'clock on Saturday morning feeling refreshed. I threw on my running shoes and headed out for a jog on the trails that surrounded the property. But almost immediately, a strange sensation washed over me. You know that horrible, prickly feeling you get when you are convinced that someone is watching you. Well, I had that exact feeling for my entire jog. Every single step I took, I felt like eyes were burning into the back of my neck. I tried to shake it off. I told myself that I was just being paranoid. After all, I am a city person at heart, and being alone in the vast, silent wilderness can play tricks on your mind. I blamed it entirely on my own anxiety and kept moving. After my jog, I went back inside, took a long shower, and just hung out around the house for a few hours. But the uneasy feeling did not go away. In fact, it got worse. But the problem was, I kept hearing these weird, subtle noises throughout the cabin. Little creaks, soft thuds, and shifting sounds. Once again, I tried to rationalize it. I told myself it was just my anxiety acting up. I was staying in an old wooden cabin up in the mountains. Of course it was going to make noise as the wood expanded and contracted in the mountain air. It was completely normal. I left the house a little after 3:30 in the afternoon and drove into the local town. I met up with my coworkers at a small restaurant, and we spent a few hours taking care of our business matters. We talked about our quarterly goals, discussed upcoming projects, and managed to get all our work done ahead of schedule. Once we wrapped up our work, we decided to head over to a local bar to have a few drinks. I have to admit, by this point, I was actually dreading going back to the cabin. I did not want to admit it to my coworkers, and I barely wanted to admit it to myself, but I was seriously freaked out. The combination of that persistent feeling of being watched on my jog, the strange noises in the house, and the sheer isolation of the property was starting to get to me. The cabin was just a little too remote for my liking. Because of this underlying fear, I was more than happy to take my sweet time getting back. I even offered to host a little after-party at the cabin, hoping that having people around would make me feel safer. But my coworkers were exhausted and decided to turn in for the night just before 10 o'clock. I realized I had no choice but to face my fears and head back to the cabin alone. I put my anxieties aside and started the drive back up the mountain. The entire drive was a mental battle. I spent the whole time trying to reason with the irrational, terrified part of my brain. I kept repeating to myself over and over again that it was just a house. Houses make noises. I was perfectly safe. All I had to do was get back, lock all the doors, triple check them, and go to sleep. I arrived back at the cabin at around 10:45. To my relief, I was incredibly tired from the long day. I was confident that my exhaustion would win over my nerves and allow me to fall asleep. True to my promise, I walked around the entire house and checked every single door lock 3 times. Once I was absolutely certain everything was locked tight, I went to bed. But sleep did not come easily. I spent the next few hours tossing and turning. I would occasionally drift off into a light sleep, only to be jolted wide awake by some random noise outside. I would lie there in the dark, heart pounding, for 20 minutes at a time before calming down again. Eventually, I decided to turn on some soft music on my phone to try and drown out the ambient noise of the woods. But that did not work either. The music actually became a distraction that kept me awake. And even with the music playing, I could still hear those strange, muffled sounds echoing through the house. It was a little after midnight when I finally gave up on trying to sleep. I decided to head downstairs to the back deck, to smoke a cigarette, and think about whether I should just pack up my bags and leave early in the morning. I grabbed my coat, my phone, and my cigarettes, and made my way out of the bedroom. I walked down the hallway, and the wooden stairs creaked softly under my weight. The stairs led directly down into the main living room. If you turned left at the bottom of the staircase, it opened up into a large open-concept dining room and kitchen. At the very back of this room was a large glass sliding door that led out onto the deck. I took just one step into the dark room, and my eyes scanned the space. The room was mostly dark, illuminated only by the faint moonlight filtering through the windows. But as I looked toward the kitchen, my breath caught in my throat. I could see a distinct shadow standing near the counter. It was blocking the moonlight coming from the kitchen window. I felt a cold dread sink deep into my stomach, turning into a complete cyclone of panic. I stood there, frozen. I desperately tried to convince myself that I was just seeing things. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the trees outside. I decided that the only way to conquer this fear was to face it. I reached out and flipped the light switch on. The image of what I saw in that instant is still burned into my brain. It is hands down the most terrifying thing I have ever seen in my life. Standing right there in the middle of the kitchen, clear as day, was a man. He was about 6 feet tall, with long, shaggy hair and a thick, unkempt beard. He looked to be in his late 30s. For a moment there was a silent, agonizing standoff. Neither of us moved. Neither of us said a word. The silence lasted for maybe 10 or 15 seconds, but in that moment it felt like an eternity. He was hunched over slightly, his eyes locked onto mine, just staring. Then, without warning, the man lunged at me. He erupted into a sudden, aggressive sprint. Fortunately for me, there was a large island counter in the center of the kitchen. He could not run directly at me and had to go around it. That split second gave me the head start I needed. I spun around and sprinted back up the stairs toward my bedroom. As I ran, I realized that locking myself in a room is exactly what stupid characters do in horror movies. But in that moment of pure survival instinct, it felt like my only option. I knew I could not make it to the front or back doors of the cabin without him catching me. And even if I did escape outside, I did not have my car keys, and I had no idea if this man was armed. Running aimlessly into the pitch black, freezing mountain woods seemed like a death sentence. My bedroom felt like the safest bet. I could lock the heavy wooden door, call the authorities, and pray that the door would hold until help arrived. I slammed the bedroom door shut, turned the lock, and ran straight into the closet. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely unlock my phone. I dialed 911. The dispatcher answered, and I frantically gave her the address of the cabin, begging her to send help immediately. She was incredibly calm and stayed on the line with me, assuring me that officers were already on their way. But while I was hiding in that closet, the nightmare got worse. The man reached my bedroom door and began to beat on it. He was slamming his body and his fists against the wood with terrifying force. The impacts sounded like thunder in the quiet cabin. But the most disturbing part was what he was saying. Between these violent strikes, he was yelling out in a strained, emotional voice. He kept shouting that he loved me. He kept screaming that he had changed. I had gotten a very clear look at this man in the kitchen, and I knew with absolute certainty that I had never seen him before in my life. I started screaming back through the door, yelling that I did not know who he was, and that he had the wrong person. But it was like he could not even hear me. He was completely detached from reality. He just kept slamming against the wood, crying out about how much he loved me and how he needed me to come back to him. And then I heard the wood begin to splinter. I looked out from the closet and watched in horror as the door frame started to give way. His fist actually punched right through the wood of the door. I thought I was going to die, but just as his hand reached through the broken panel, the distant sound of sirens echoed through the valley. It was the most beautiful sound I have ever heard. Within seconds, multiple police cars pulled into the driveway. The timing was absolutely perfect. Just as the man was on the verge of breaking the lock and entering the room, I heard a massive crash from the hallway, followed by officers shouting commands. Knowing the police were there, I decided to make my escape. I threw open the bedroom window, which led out onto a small flat section of the roof. I climbed out, planning to slide down to the ground. As it turned out, the crash I had heard was the police tackling the man to the floor right outside my bedroom. I flagged down one of the officers from the roof, and he helped me climb down safely. The police dragged the man out of the cabin in handcuffs. Even as they threw him into the back of the patrol car, he was still screaming incoherently. The police immediately called the property owner, and that is when the terrifying truth finally came to light. It turns out that this man was the ex-fiance of the woman who owned the Airbnb. After a highly toxic and painful breakup, the man had completely gone off the grid. But the most horrifying detail of all was what the police discovered when they searched the cabin. This man had not just broken into the house that night. He had actually been living inside one of the hallway closets for several days. Inside the closet, officers found a collection of empty beer cans, half-eaten snack foods, a sleeping bag, and personal items. He had been hiding in the walls of the cabin the entire time I was there. He had been watching me. He had been the source of those strange noises I kept dismissing as anxiety. I still do not know why he did not act sooner, but I am endlessly grateful that he waited. If I had not decided to go downstairs for a cigarette at that exact moment, I would have still been asleep in bed. The police later revealed that the man had a large kitchen knife tucked into his waistband. I must have interrupted him as he was retrieving the knife from the kitchen. The homeowner was absolutely devastated and felt incredibly guilty about what happened. The last I heard, the man was facing major prison time. It still terrifies me to think that I checked those locks 3 times, but it did not matter at all. The monster was already inside. I guess you truly never know what is lurking in the dark. In my case, a bad habit like smoking actually saved my life. Now, the second story I want to share with you is also incredibly strange. For a long time, I actually downplayed what happened, convincing myself that I was just overreacting. But looking back on it now, it gives me absolute chills. This happened about 2 years ago. I had applied for a new job, and the company wanted to do an in-person interview. The only catch was that the office was located in another state, about a 5-hour drive from where I lived. It was a long trip for a single interview, and I originally planned to just drive down, do the interview, and then drive all the way back home the same day. But when I told my soon-to-be wife about the plan, she stopped me. She pointed out that driving 10 hours in a single day, on top of the stress of a major job interview, was a terrible idea. She suggested that I have a place to stay overnight. Now, I have to confess that I am completely hopeless when it comes to technology and travel apps. I had never even used Airbnb before. Seeing how stressed I was, my fiancée downloaded the app onto my phone, set up an account, and found a really nice-looking place that was only about a 10-minute drive from the interview location. She booked it for me, and I packed my bags, ready for the big day. The host of the Airbnb turned out to be an incredibly nice guy. While we were messaging back and forth on the app, I mentioned that I was coming to town for a job interview. He was so accommodating. He told me that since the cabin was empty that morning, I was welcome to check in early. That way, I could unpack my things, take a shower, and mentally prepare for the interview without having to rush straight from a 5-hour drive. I was so grateful for his kindness. The owner sent me the digital code for the front door and gave me clear instructions on how to use the keypad. It was actually a very simple system where you just had to press a single button to lock it, which was great since I had never used a keypad lock before. I arrived at the house around noon. My interview was scheduled for 3 o'clock, which gave me plenty of time to get ready. When I plugged the interview address into my GPS, it showed that the office was only a 9-minute drive away. Even so, I decided to leave 30 minutes early, just in case I ran into traffic or got lost. Fortunately, the interview went incredibly well, but as soon as I left the building, my anxious brain kicked in. At this point, I spent the entire drive back to the Airbnb second-guessing every single answer I had given. I kept wondering if I had sounded too rehearsed, or if my answers about my previous management experience had been clear enough. I have always had a habit of doing that when I am nervous. To distract myself, I stopped at a local spot, grabbed some tacos for dinner, and headed back to the house. I spent the rest of the evening just relaxing. I ate my tacos, talked to my fiancée on the phone to tell her how the interview went, and then decided to put on a movie. I have always been a bit of a clean freak, and even though I know these rental places are professionally cleaned, I still feel highly uncomfortable sleeping in a bed that has been used by hundreds of strangers. Because of this quirk, I decided from the start that I was not going to sleep in the bedroom. Instead, I planned to sleep on the living room couch and hit the road first thing in the morning. The living room was actually incredibly cozy. It had this massive, fluffy wraparound sectional couch positioned right in front of a beautiful fireplace. Mounted above the fireplace was a huge television. To make things even better, the room was equipped with a top-of-the-line surround sound system. I was perfectly happy spending my night right there, watching movies until I drifted off to sleep. Around 11 o'clock that night, I grabbed a warm blanket from one of the bedrooms, settled onto the couch, and put on the movie Avengers Endgame. I was only about 15 minutes into the movie when my eyes started getting heavy, and I began to drift off. But my sleep was cut incredibly short. I was suddenly startled awake by the distinct sound of the front doorbell ringing. I lay there on the couch for a moment, completely still, blinking in the darkness. I was disoriented and wasn't sure if the sound was part of the movie or if I had dreamed it. But a few seconds later, the doorbell rang again. It was a loud, clear chime. I couldn't believe it. Someone was actually ringing my doorbell in the middle of the night. I grabbed my phone from the coffee table and checked the time. It was 11:33. I couldn't comprehend why anyone would be knocking on a stranger's door at this hour. My initial instinct was to just ignore it and hope they would go away. But then, the doorbell rang a third time. With each ring, my heart pounded harder against my ribs. By the fourth ring, my anxiety turned into a mix of curiosity and frustration. I decided I had to go see who it was. I wondered if maybe it was the police or a neighbor with an emergency. I stood up and cautiously walked toward the front entryway. Before opening the door, I leaned over to look out the narrow windows next to the frame. The view was partially blocked, but I could make out the figure of a very skinny man standing on the porch. He was holding a small brown paper bag in his hands. His head was bowed low, and he looked almost completely unresponsive, just staring down at his feet. I unlocked the main wooden door and pulled it open, but I made sure to leave the metal screen door shut and locked. The porch light was very dim, making it difficult to get a look at his face. Without raising his head, that man spoke in a flat, hollow voice. He told me that he had a pizza delivery for me, but the problem was, he was clearly not holding a pizza box, just that small, crumpled brown paper bag. I politely told him through the screen door that he had the wrong house, and that I hadn't ordered any food. I closed the heavy wooden door and started walking back to the living room, and then the doorbell rang again. Frustrated, I marched back to the entry and threw the door open. Before I could even yell at him to leave, the man spoke again. In that same bleak monotone voice, he repeated that he had my pizza. I raised my voice, telling him loudly that I did not order any pizza. The man responded by slowly reciting the exact address of the Airbnb, insisting that the delivery was meant for this specific house. As I was arguing with him, my eyes drifted down to his hands. I watched in sudden panic as his fingers reached out and grabbed the handle of the locked screen door. He tried to pull it open. That was the moment my annoyance turned into genuine alarm. I didn't want to show him how freaked out I was, so I just yelled at him to get off the property before I called the police. And I slammed the wooden door shut. I immediately crouched down and crept over to the front window to see what he would do next. Through the glass, I saw him stand frozen on the porch for another minute. Finally, he turned around and walked down the driveway. He got into a beat-up red sedan that was parked at the curb. I couldn't tell what make or model it was, but I noticed that one of the front headlights was completely broken. Once I saw him get into the car, I let out a massive sigh of relief. Strangely enough, after all that adrenaline, I realized I was actually hungry. I walked into the kitchen to grab a snack. But as I walked back into the living room, I noticed that the room was still brightly illuminated. When I looked outside, this guy was still sitting in the driveway. The driver had turned his high beams on, and they were shining directly through the front window of the house. I decided to head upstairs to one of the bedrooms, thinking I would have a much better vantage point from the second floor. From the upstairs window, the glare of the high beams was so intense that I couldn't see inside the car, but I could clearly see the exhaust coming from the tailpipe. The car was running, and he was just sitting there. I was still more annoyed than truly terrified. I debated whether I should call the police or just go out there myself and tell him to get lost. I foolishly decided that I didn't want to bother the police over something that might just be a weird mistake. I thought I could handle it. I put my shoes back on, puffed out my chest, and marched outside like I was some kind of hero. But when I reached the driver's side window of the red car, my heart stopped. It turns out the car was completely empty. The engine was running, the keys were in the ignition, and the lights were on, but there was no one inside. In an instant, a wave of pure terror hit me. Without thinking, I turned around and sprinted back to the house as fast as my legs could carry me. I slammed the door, locked it, and threw the heavy safety chain into place. I stood in the dark hallway, hyperventilating, trying to understand why he would leave his car running and where he could have gone. I grabbed my phone and ran back upstairs to the bedroom. I immediately sent a frantic text to the Airbnb owner, but I didn't get a response. I spent the next several hours staring out the window. I kept debating whether to call 911, but I kept convincing myself that I was overreacting. A few minutes later, I saw the skinny man walk back into the frame. He was coming from the side of the house near the front door. He quietly climbed back into the driver's seat of the red sedan, backed out of the driveway, and drove away. I was so shaken up that I couldn't sleep. I spent the entire night lying on the bedroom floor, watching random YouTube videos to keep my mind occupied. At 4 o'clock in the morning, I decided I had had enough. I took a quick shower, packed my bags, and got ready to leave. But as I approached the front entryway to leave, I froze. The heavy wooden front door was unlocked and sitting slightly ajar. The only thing keeping it from opening completely was the safety chain I had latched. I stood there in absolute shock. I tried to convince myself that I must have forgotten to lock it, but deep down I knew I had locked it. Then it hit me. I had never locked the outer screen door when I ran back inside. As the morning sun began to rise, I made a mad dash to my car, terrified that the man might still be waiting. As I backed out of the driveway, I glanced at the front porch and noticed the brown paper bag sitting on the steps. I had run past it so fast earlier that I hadn't even seen it. I briefly thought about going back to see what was inside, but I decided I didn't want to know. I drove down the street, and as I reached the end of the block, I saw a dilapidated green house. Parked in the driveway was a beat-up red sedan with a broken front headlight. It was the exact same car. Later that morning, the Airbnb host texted me to apologize for missing my messages and asked how my stay was. I detailed everything that had happened, including the strange red car at the green house down the street. I saw the typing bubbles appear on the screen as he began to reply, but then they disappeared. He never messaged me back. A few weeks later, I decided to look up the listing again out of curiosity, and I discovered that the house had been completely removed from Airbnb. I don't know if it was a coordinated setup or just a series of bizarre coincidences, but thinking back on it now makes my blood run cold. This final story is a reminder that the most terrifying monsters in this world are not ghosts or supernatural entities, but very real people who want to do you harm. My family still has not fully recovered from the sheer terror we experienced last summer, and honestly, I am worried that they might never completely heal from the trauma. To help you understand what happened, I will start right at the very beginning. My wife and I wanted to take our 2 children on a small, relaxing summer vacation. We weren't planning anything extravagant, just a few nights away near the ocean where we could unwind. While searching for accommodations, I was highly surprised to find that renting an entire home through Airbnb was actually significantly cheaper than booking a standard hotel room near the boardwalk. My wife spent a few hours searching the app and eventually found a fantastic property. It wasn't located directly on the beach, but it was only about a 5-minute walk to the sand, and the rental price was incredibly reasonable compared to the oceanfront hotels. The location of the house was very unique. It sat directly at the very end of a quiet dead-end street. Right behind the property line was a slow-moving creek, surrounded by a thick wall of trees. It felt incredibly private and secluded, which we all thought was a wonderful bonus. We arrived in the coastal town in the mid-afternoon. Because the weather was so perfect, we decided to spend a few hours playing on the beach before we even went to check into the house. My son was 8 years old at the time, and my daughter was 13. Like most siblings their age, they usually spent most of their time bickering and fighting over everything. But something about being near the ocean seemed to bring out the best in them. They were playing together beautifully, laughing, and building sandcastles like best friends. Looking back, that peaceful afternoon on the beach was probably the absolute highlight of our entire trip, because everything started going downhill very quickly after that. We finally made our way to the house at around 5 o'clock in the evening to unpack our belongings. The kids eagerly ran upstairs to claim their respective bedrooms, and we all took turns showering and washing the salty beach sand off ourselves. My wife had brought a large cooler filled with pre-prepared ingredients, so she could cook home meals instead of us having to eat out at expensive restaurants every single night. She genuinely loves to cook, which is a massive win for me because there is nothing better than a home-cooked meal. Our agreement has always been very simple. She does the cooking, and I handle the dishes. It has always felt like a perfectly fair trade-off. That first night, we stayed up late as a family playing card games like Uno and laughing together before finally heading to bed. I slept like an absolute baby that night. I was so relaxed and comfortable. Unfortunately, I cannot say the same thing about my 8-year-old son. The next morning, when he came down for breakfast, the poor kid looked completely exhausted. He had deep bags under his eyes and barely even touched his food. I sat down next to him and asked him what was wrong, but he just lowered his head and refused to say a word. He looked deeply embarrassed and upset. After a little bit of gentle prying from both me and my wife, he finally caved in and told us what had happened. He looked up at us with wide, terrified eyes and claimed that he had seen ghosts in the backyard the previous night. My wife and I exchanged a worried look. But the problem was, my 8-year-old son was insisting that our vacation home was haunted. When I asked him to explain exactly what he had seen, he told us that he had watched dark shadows moving around in the backyard. He said he had looked out his bedroom window and seen several human-shaped shadows creep out of the tree line near the creek, walk right up to the house, and disappear from his view. After a while, he saw them emerge again and retreat back into the safety of the dark woods. But the detail that really sent chills down my spine was when he said that one of the shadows had turned around, looked directly up at his second-story window, and waved at him. The poor kid was in absolute tears as he recounted the story. He was trembling from head to toe. Whatever he had actually seen out there, it had clearly terrified him to his core. My wife and I immediately went into parenting mode. We sat him down, gave him a big hug, and gave him the standard speech about how ghosts are not real, and how his mind was probably just playing tricks on him because he was in a strange new environment. My wife was particularly vocal, trying to make him laugh by making silly ghost noises, but he remained completely stoic. Even his older sister chimed in to comfort him. It took a while, but eventually, he calmed down and started acting like his normal, energetic self again. We spent the day at the beach, splashing in the waves and enjoying the sunshine, trying to put the morning's fright behind us. When we returned to the cabin that evening, I noticed something that made me pause. The front door was completely unlocked. I turned to my wife and asked her if she had locked it when we left, but she couldn't remember. Unlike me, she isn't compulsive about security, and she often forgets to lock up. I would have been more upset, but thankfully, we had taken all our valuable electronics and wallets with us to the beach. I did a quick walkthrough of the house, and since nothing appeared to be missing or out of place, I let it go. We had another pleasant evening of cooking, eating, and playing card games, and the kids went to bed around 10 o'clock. My wife and I stayed up for another hour or so, sipping a couple of drinks and talking quietly. I didn't look at the clock, but I estimate it was close to midnight when we heard a frantic knock on our bedroom door. I opened it to find my son standing there. He was trembling so violently he could barely form words. He whispered that the ghosts were back, and they were in the yard again. I sprang out of bed and rushed to the window, but when I looked out into the darkness, I didn't see anything. I asked my son to point them out, but he was too terrified to even look out the glass. The only unusual detail was that the backyard motion sensor floodlight was shining brightly. But I rationalized that a stray animal, or even a strong gust of wind blowing the tree branches, could have easily triggered the sensor. I spent the next 10 minutes holding my son, trying to calm him down. When he finally stopped crying enough to speak, he whispered something that made my stomach drop. He told me that one of the ghosts had walked up to his bedroom window and tapped on the glass. He said the shadow spoke to him through the window, telling him that if he screamed or made a sound, he would hurt his entire family. According to my son, he had begged the figure to leave him alone, and the voice had replied that they would leave if he opened the back door for them. Instead of opening the door, my brave little boy had run straight to our room. I was deeply alarmed, not because I believed in ghosts, but because someone or something was clearly out there terrorizing my son. I wondered if my daughter had let him watch a horror movie he wasn't supposed to see, or if he was just suffering from severe homesickness. He slept in our bed that night, and I barely got any rest because I could feel his small body shaking with fear all night long. At breakfast the next morning the situation was the same. He looked exhausted, refused to eat, and looked like he was about to fall asleep right into his breakfast plate. I knew I had to do something to make him feel safe. I pitched an exciting idea to the family. I suggested that we have a massive campout in the living room that night. We could build a giant blanket fort, pull all the cushions onto the floor, and all sleep together like a family slumber party. The kids loved the idea, especially my son. He figured that if the ghosts came back, at least his dad would be right there to protect him. We spent the evening building the fort and playing games, and eventually we all drifted off to sleep. But at 2:30 in the morning, my son shook my shoulder, waking me up. He whispered that the ghosts were outside right now. I quietly sat up, expecting to see an empty yard, but what I saw through the glass sliding door made my breath catch in my throat. Standing right on our back deck, illuminated by the bright floodlight, were 3 hooded figures. They were wearing identical, terrifying black masks, with large, bulging white eyes that looked like golf balls. I let out a loud shout of pure panic, which instantly woke up my wife and daughter. As soon as they saw the masked figures staring back at them through the glass, they began to scream. In the chaos, I watched in horror as one of the figures stepped forward and began violently shaking the handle of the sliding glass door. Thankfully, I had secured the latch and placed a wooden security bar in the track before going to sleep. Realizing they couldn't get in easily, my daughter quickly dialed 911. I grabbed a heavy wooden walking stick that was leaning in the corner of the room and stepped between my screaming family and the glass door. I knew that if they had firearms, my wooden stick was completely useless, but my adrenaline was pumping, and my only thought was protecting my wife and children. I began screaming at them to get away from my family. Instead of running, the intruders seemed to find our terror amusing. They stood there, taunting us, swaying back and forth. Then, the figure on the left reached into his pocket and pulled out a large knife, slowly waving the blade back and forth against the glass. My family was hysterical, weeping and pleading for their lives. I will never forget the sound of those desperate screams. And then, out of nowhere, a police officer charged onto the deck and tackled the armed intruder to the ground. The other 2 suspects turned and bolted into the yard, but they didn't get far before they were cornered and arrested by backup officers. When the police finally removed their masks, I was shocked to see 3 young, ordinary-looking men. We later learned that 2 of them were 20 years old and 1 was 18. My son had mistaken them for ghosts because they were dressed in all black and moving through the dark woods. It turns out, all 3 suspects were carrying large knives. After speaking with the local detectives, we learned that there was a local gang of young punks who specifically targeted out-of-town tourists. They targeted houses at the end of secluded streets, knowing that families on vacation often carried cash and were easier to intimidate. It sickened me to realize how calculated they were. While the police tried to reassure us that they were likely only after our money, the thought of what could have happened if that sliding door had been left unlocked is a nightmare I will never be able to forget. The psychological scars from that night will stay with my family forever. We cut our vacation short and drove home first thing that morning, and I can promise you that we will never return to that town again. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. What I am about to tell you is something that has no easy explanation. It is easily the strangest and most unsettling thing that has ever happened to me, or to anyone I personally know. For several years, I worked late hours at a small, dimly lit dive bar about 30 minutes away from my house. It was not really a choice I made because of some great passion for bartending. It was just how things were when you lived out in a more rural area. There were not a ton of jobs close to home, so you basically took whatever you could get to pay the bills. The bar itself was nothing special. It had sticky floors, a loud jukebox, and a handful of regulars who stayed until the very last call. But it was steady work, and most nights went by without much happening. The night this all occurred started out exactly like any other. My shift had gone by slowly, filled with the usual routine of pouring draft beers, washing glasses, and listening to the same old stories from the locals. After closing everything up, locking the back doors, and turning off the neon signs, I got into my car and started the long drive home. Most of the way back to my house consists of nothing but a series of winding back roads. There is hardly any traffic out there at that hour. There are barely any lights, barely any other cars, and barely any signs of life. Honestly, it is just long stretches of sharp curves cutting through deep woods and open farmland. It is usually a pretty quiet and peaceful drive. I have always actually liked it for that reason. It acted like a built-in detox for my brain, where I had time to zone out, listen to the hum of the tires, or think about the strange characters I had met at the bar that night. But not long into the drive, I remember thinking to myself how unusually foggy it was. Now, I have driven these exact roads more times than I can count. I know every turn, every dip, and every pothole. But that night, the visibility was worse than anything I had seen in a very long time. It was a thick, heavy blanket of white that seemed to swallow the road ahead of me. I actually had to ease off the gas pedal and take it much slower than usual, because I could barely see more than a few car lengths ahead. Even flipping on my high beams did not help at all. It actually made things worse. The bright lights just made the thick fog glow and reflect right back at me, almost like I was driving directly into a solid wall of white paint. It started to really annoy me because I knew this slow pace would add a lot of extra time to my trip, and I was absolutely exhausted from standing on my feet for 8 hours. I was about halfway home when I first noticed something unusual. Through the dense fog, maybe a little off to the right side of the road, there was this faint, yellow blinking light. At first, I figured it was just some kind of temporary roadside marker, or maybe a reflector on a farmer's fence line. But as I kept driving, the light did not get any closer, and it did not fall behind. It just stayed right there, blinking at a perfectly steady rhythm, like it was moving along with me. It was keeping pace with my car from somewhere deeper in the woods, just beyond the tree line. The whole thing felt incredibly off. I could not tell how far away the light actually was, because the fog was playing tricks on my depth perception. After about another minute of driving with that yellow light hovering in the exact same spot relative to my window, I started getting a cold, heavy feeling in my stomach. I could not even explain why I was so nervous. Something about the steady, mechanical blinking just did not sit right with me. I decided to slow down a bit, thinking that if I let off the gas, the light would keep moving forward, and I would finally get a better sense of what it actually was. Or, hopefully, it would just continue onward, disappear into the darkness, and I would not have to worry about it anymore. But as I eased the car down to almost a crawl, the light did not pull ahead. It adjusted its speed instantly. It kept blinking at the exact same steady rhythm, still holding that same precise distance off to the side of my passenger window. Whatever it was matching my speed perfectly. as if it were tethered to my car by an invisible string. That was the moment when I really started to get spooked. My heart rate began to climb, and my grip on the steering wheel tightened. I decided to bring the car to a complete stop right there in the middle of the empty road, just to see if the light would do the same. And sure enough, the moment my tires stopped rolling, the light stopped too. It stayed right there, hovering in the fog, blinking in the exact same spot with the same unchanging rhythm. I sat there in the silence of my cabin, trying to figure out what the hell I was looking at. I debated whether I should just perform a quick U-turn and drive all the way back to the main highway, or if I should just step on the gas and try to outrun it. But before I could make a decision, the light changed. The blinking did not stop, but the light itself began to get significantly brighter. It was like a small flame catching a sudden gust of wind and flaring up. It was not flashing any faster, but it was burning much stronger with each pulse, as if whatever was generating it had suddenly become more active, or was drawing more power. That was more than enough to push me over the edge. I was not about to sit there in the dark and wait for this thing to get any closer or weirder. I reached down to shift my car into reverse so I could back up and get out of there. But that was when I realized the interior of my car was completely quiet. The engine was not running. I swear to God, the car was dead silent. I had no idea how that was even possible. I had not turned the key, and there had been no sudden sputter or shake to indicate the engine had stalled. It had just died without making a single sound. The dashboard lights were completely dark, and the headlights had flickered out, leaving me in total blackness, save for that pulsing yellow light outside. The only way to kill the engine like that would have been to physically turn the key, but I distinctly remember never touching it. My hands were shaking at this point, and my hands never shake. I pour drinks and carry heavy trays all day long. My hands are usually steady as a rock. As I desperately tried to turn the key in the ignition to restart the car, I could not help but feel that the strange thing outside was directly responsible for my engine dying. I turned the key again and again, but the starter did not even make a clicking sound. The battery felt completely drained, and the engine was totally dead. Meanwhile, that blinking yellow light kept burning brighter and brighter, almost like it was feeding off the electrical energy of my car. My pulse was racing, and my chest felt incredibly tight. I was completely alone on a deserted road, miles from any town, with no working vehicle. Not knowing what else to do, I reached for my phone on the passenger seat, figuring I could at least try to get a video of the light for proof, or try to call the police for help. But as soon as I tapped the screen, nothing happened. The screen remained completely black. My phone had died. I knew for an absolute fact that I had at least 20% battery left when I left the bar. I had literally checked it right before locking the front door, but now it was completely lifeless. Before I could even begin to process the horror of my situation, the yellow light outside suddenly flared to a blinding, brilliant brightness. It was like an exploding star right next to my window. It was so intense that I physically could not keep my eyes open. I threw my arms up in front of my face and squeezed my eyes shut, feeling the heat and the sheer power of what felt like a gigantic light bulb burning right through my eyelids. I held that position for at least 10 seconds, frozen in fear, waiting for the worst to happen. And then, just like that, the bright light vanished. It was completely gone, as if someone had flipped a giant switch. The thick fog was still swirling around the car, but there was no yellow light, no blinking, and no glow in the trees. The woods were completely dark once again. My heart was still pounding against my ribs, but I instinctively reached for the key and turned the ignition one more time. This time the engine roared to life instantly, turning over as if nothing had ever been wrong with it. The dashboard lights illuminated, and the headlights cut through the fog. I did not waste another single second. I slammed the car into drive and stepped on the gas, driving the rest of the way home with my eyes glued to the road ahead. I was terrified that if I looked away, even for a split second, that awful yellow light would reappear in my side mirror. But nothing else happened that night. I made it home safely, locked my front doors, and sat awake until the sun came up. In the days that followed, I told this story to almost everyone I knew. I told my family, my friends, and even a couple of the regular customers at the bar. But no one had an explanation that made any sense to me. I heard every theory you could think of, from ball lightning and swamp gas to secret military drones, but Deep down, I knew what I felt. Whatever was out in those woods that night had completely drained the power from my car and my phone, and it was watching me. To this day, I still avoid driving those winding back roads after dark, preferring to take the longer highway route home, even if it adds 30 minutes to my drive. Now, that was just the first strange encounter on the dark roads. This next story happened a couple of years back, and it involves a man named David, who is a long-haul truck driver. David had been driving big rigs for over 15 years, so he was very used to the long stretches of absolutely nothing. He actually preferred the night shifts because the highways were usually clear of commuters, allowing him to cover more ground without the stress of heavy traffic. On this particular night, David was on his second-to-last delivery of a cross-state loop, just trying to knock out the remaining miles so he could finally get back home to his family. The route he was taking had him cutting through one of those desolate desert highways that barely get any traffic at night. There were no towns for miles, no gas stations, and barely even any streetlights. It was just a simple 2-lane road slicing through the open, empty desert under a vast sky full of cold stars. It is the exact kind of drive where you start to feel like you are the only person left on the entire planet. The rhythmic hum of the truck's massive diesel engine was the only sound for miles around. David was about an hour out from his next drop-off destination when he first noticed something in his mirrors. He glanced into his left side mirror and was surprised to see a pair of headlights trailing far behind him. It was a dark SUV. It was not riding his bumper or driving in an aggressive manner, but it was definitely following him. It was keeping a very wide, consistent distance, but it adjusted its speed to match David's truck perfectly. No matter how fast or how slow David went, the dark SUV stayed exactly where it was. For nearly 40 miles, the vehicle just hovered there in David's mirrors. It was always visible, always keeping that same strange artificial gap. The driver never tried to speed up, and they never tried to pass, even when the road opened up into long, flat straightaways. At first, David thought it was just a nervous driver who was afraid to pass a massive semi-truck in the dark. He figured they were just using his truck as a guide through the pitch-black desert. But he quickly cast that theory aside, after driving through several clearly marked passing zones with perfect visibility. There was absolutely no logical reason for the driver to stay behind him, unless they were doing it on purpose. As much as David was dying to know what the driver's problem was, he had a tight schedule to keep. He could not afford to waste his night worrying about a strange car. So, he tried his best to ignore the headlights in his mirror. But the longer the tailing continued, the more unsettled he became. It was starting to make his skin crawl, which was something that rarely happened to an experienced driver like him. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, David decided he had had enough. He pulled his massive rig off the highway and into a small, remote roadside rest area. It was not a fully equipped truck stop with a diner and bright lights. It was just a simple dirt lot with a few faded parking lines and a small concrete shed that housed a couple of old vending machines. There were no external lights in the entire lot, except for one single, dim bulb flickering weakly above the vending machines, casting long, dancing shadows across the dirt. David's plan was simple. He would stretch his legs for a minute, grab a cold soda from the machine, and more importantly, let the strange SUV pass him on the highway so he could finally get some peace. But as he checked his side mirrors before shutting down the engine, his heart sank. The dark SUV had pulled into the dirt lot right behind him. It did not park near the truck, though. Instead, it drove over to the far, darkest corner of the lot, turned off its headlights, and just sat there in the shadows. At that point, whatever confusion or discomfort David had been feeling turned into pure, hot anger. He was tired, he was stressed, and he was completely fed up with being followed. Whoever was driving that SUV was about to get a very loud piece of his mind. David aggressively pushed open his cab door, stepped down onto the loose gravel, and began marching directly toward the dark vehicle. He did not try to hide his anger at all, keeping his shoulders back and his fists clenched. But as he was stomping his way across the dark lot, the occupants of the SUV must have realized that their cover was blown. Before David could even get halfway to the vehicle, the SUV's engine suddenly roared to life with a loud rev. The driver slammed the vehicle into gear and peeled out of the dirt space like they were running from the law. They kicked up a massive cloud of thick dust and sharp gravel that rained down on the dirt lot. As the vehicle sped past David toward the highway exit, he tried desperately to get a look at the driver through the windows. But the glass was heavily tinted, and the lack of light made it completely impossible to see anything inside. David watched as the SUV swung back onto the empty highway, its tires screeching loudly on the asphalt. Within a matter of seconds, the red taillights faded into the distance and vanished entirely. Part of David was incredibly relieved. The nuisance was finally gone, and he could go back to his work in peace. But another, deeper part of him was highly unsettled. He had just confirmed that this vehicle had indeed been stalking him for hours, and the fact that they fled the moment he approached meant their intentions were almost certainly hostile. As David walked back from the vending machines, which turned out to be completely empty and broken anyway, he realized just how exhausted the entire encounter had made him. The sudden spike of adrenaline had left him feeling completely drained. He did not want to get back on the highway in that state of mind. He figured he had earned a short break to recharge his batteries before finishing the final leg of his route in the morning. He did a quick walk around of his truck, checking the heavy cargo doors to ensure the metal seals and locks were still secure and undamaged. Everything seemed perfectly fine. He climbed back up into his warm cab, locked both of the doors from the inside, reclined his driver's seat, and cracked the window just a tiny bit to let some cool desert air circulate. The dirt lot was completely silent now, and for the first time all night, David felt his muscles start to relax. He reasoned that even if those people meant him harm, they would not turn around and come back. Finding this specific, unlit dirt lot in the middle of a pitch-black desert without any headlights would be nearly impossible. Because of his extreme exhaustion and the newfound quiet, David fell asleep in a matter of minutes. Now it is important to know that David is an incredibly light sleeper. He had to be. When you spend years sleeping in sketchy roadside pull-offs and dark truck stops, you naturally develop a sort of survival instinct. You learn to tune your ears to the slightest changes in your environment. If someone is messing with your fuel tanks, or trying to steal your cargo while you are asleep, waking up quickly is the only thing standing between you and a very dangerous situation. Sure enough, about an hour after he fell asleep, David was suddenly jolted awake by a very faint, distinct sound. It was the light, sharp crunch of footsteps pressing into the loose gravel right outside his truck. Even though he was still groggy from his sleep, his instincts kicked in immediately. He kept completely silent, moving as slowly as possible so as not to make the truck's suspension squeak. He slid over to the side window and gently parted the edge of his window blinds just enough to peer down into the dark lot. To his absolute horror, there were two figures standing near the rear wheels of his trailer. They were crouched down low in the shadows, using a small flashlight with a red filter to inspect the heavy lower latch mechanisms of the cargo doors. They were working in complete silence, signaling to each other with quick hand movements. David did not have a weapon in his cab. He usually did not carry one, but he was fully prepared to grab his heavy metal tire iron and defend his life and his cargo if they managed to break in. As he watched through the sliver of the blinds, one of the men reached into a dark canvas bag and pulled out a large, heavy-duty pair of bolt cutters. They were preparing to cut the steel lock on his trailer. That was the absolute limit for David. Without hesitating for another second, he lunged forward and slammed his hand down onto his steering wheel, activating the truck's incredibly loud air horn. The horn let out a deafening, earth-shaking blast that shattered the quiet of the desert night. The reaction from the two thieves was instantaneous. Both men jumped into the air as if they had been struck by lightning, dropping their tools onto the gravel. They scrambled backward in sheer terror, running as fast as their legs could carry them toward the thick brush on the side of the highway. Not 10 seconds later, a pair of headlights suddenly appeared from the dark highway. It was the exact same dark SUV from before. It roared back into the dirt lot with its lights turned off initially, before whipping around to pick up the two fleeing men. They scrambled into the back doors, and the SUV sped away into the darkness, its tires throwing dirt everywhere. David did not even have time to get out of his cab before the entire ordeal was over. Once his heart rate slowed down enough for him to think straight, he picked up his phone and called the state police. He mostly just wanted to get the incident on official record, but the dispatcher insisted that he stay parked exactly where he was until a patrol unit could arrive to inspect the scene. It took nearly 45 minutes, but eventually, two state troopers pulled into the dirt lot, their flashing blue and red lights illuminating the area. They helped David inspect the back of his trailer with their high-powered flashlights. Sure enough, there were fresh, deep metal pry marks along the lower locking bars of the cargo doors, right where the two men had been working. Luckily, the heavy-duty steel lock had held up, and they had not been able to get the doors open. The officers told David that they had been investigating a string of similar incidents along that specific desert corridor. It was the work of an organized cargo theft ring that targeted lone, parked trucks at night. They would follow a truck for miles, wait for the driver to pull over to sleep, and then strike in the dark. If David had not been such a light sleeper, his entire cargo would have been stolen, and he easily could have been severely hurt or killed if he had surprised them. That incident remained the most terrifying experience of David's long career on the road. But as scary as that was, it is not the only way criminals use the dark, empty roads to trap unsuspecting victims. This third story involves a young man named Julian, who was 18 years old at the time and absolutely loved going for late-night drives during the summer. There is truly nothing better than a night drive when the weather is warm. You can roll all the windows down, let the warm summer breeze fill the car, and listen to the tires hum on the empty highway. Around Julian's hometown, the roads were almost completely empty after midnight. There were no commuters, no heavy trucks, and very rarely any police patrols. It was the perfect environment for someone who loved to drive, and Julian had a very special car for these drives. His father owned a beautifully maintained BMW M3, a high-performance sports car with incredible speed and handling. Now, Julian was not a reckless teenager who wanted to drag race or destroy his father's prized possession. He had a deep respect for the car, but he did enjoy taking it out to experience its quick acceleration and sharp steering on the winding country roads when no one else was around. On this particular summer night, Julian was out on a solo joyride. The passenger seat was empty, the stereo was turned completely off, and his entire focus was on the beautiful sound of the engine and the rush of the warm wind against his face. It was the only time he felt completely free from the stress of school and everyday life. As he was cruising along the main highway, he suddenly got a strong, almost overwhelming urge to pull off and explore some of the narrow back roads that cut through the surrounding farmlands. It was one of those sudden gut feelings that you cannot really explain, but you know you will not be able to sleep unless you satisfy it. So he took the next exit and began navigating a network of dark, twisting country lanes. The roads out there were extremely narrow, lined with tall cornfields on both sides, and filled with sharp, unexpected bends. Julian let the car open up a bit, taking the curves with just enough speed to feel the high-performance tires grip the asphalt. The world felt completely dead. It was just him, the sports car, and the endless black road. But as he came around a particularly sharp bend, his headlights caught a sudden flash of metallic reflection up ahead. Julian gasped and slammed his foot onto the brake pedal. The ABS system kicked in, the tires shrieked, and the car slid forward, coming to a halt just a couple of feet away from an object, sitting directly in the center of the lane. Once his breathing slowed down, Julian stared through the windshield to see what he had almost crashed into. It was a standard metal shopping cart. It was just sitting there, perfectly centered in the middle of the dark road, miles away from any grocery store or shopping center. The way his headlights bounced off the metal basket was the only reason he had seen it in time. The entire situation made absolutely no sense. Why would a shopping cart be sitting on a remote country road at midnight? Against his better judgment, Julian pushed the button to put the car in park, activated his hazard lights, and stepped out of the driver's seat to investigate. Looking back, he knew he should have just put the car in reverse and driven away. But his curiosity completely took over. The warm night air was filled with the sound of thousands of crickets, and the only other noise was the soft, metallic ticking of the hot BMW engine cooling down. Julian walked slowly up to the shopping cart, his eyes searching the empty basket. He half expected to find something bizarre inside, but it was completely empty. It was just a normal shopping cart. As he turned around to head back to his idling car, A sudden movement on the side of the road caught his eye. Two dark figures suddenly burst out from the tall cornfields just a few yards away. They were sprinting at full speed, coming straight toward him. In that split second, Julian's survival instincts took over. His brain did not even have time to process who they were or what they wanted. He knew it was a matter of life or death. He turned and bolted back to the BMW, throwing himself into the driver's seat and slamming the heavy door shut. His hand flew to the start button and punched it, forcing the engine to roar back to life. But just as he grabbed the gear shifter, the two figures reached the car. One of them stopped a few feet away, but the other one did not even slow down. He ran at full speed directly into the passenger side of the car, crashing into the door with a loud, sickening thump. He hit the car so hard that Julian felt the entire chassis shake, yet the man did not even seem to flinch. It was as if he did not even realize the car was a solid object. Julian locked eyes with the man through the passenger window, and the sheer terror of that moment froze him in place. The man's face was pressed close to the glass. He had wide, beady, bloodshot eyes that stared with a vacant, empty expression. His clothes were completely torn to shreds, as if he had been running through thick briars and barbed wire fences in the dark fields. His hair was wild and soaking wet with sweat, and his face was smeared with a mixture of dark dirt and fresh blood. He looked like a monster. He did not scream or make a sound, but he began frantically clawing and fumbling at the passenger door handle, trying desperately to pull the door open. Thank God the BMW had an automatic locking system that engaged the moment Julian had started the engine. The sight of those bloody hands grabbing the door handle snapped Julian out of his paralysis. He slammed his foot onto the gas pedal, turned the steering wheel hard to swerve around the metal shopping cart, and sped down the road, leaving the two figures behind in a cloud of dust. During the entire drive home, Julian was a complete nervous wreck. He was shaking violently, his mind racing with a million different thoughts. Part of him felt a strange sense of guilt, wondering if that bloody man was actually a victim who was desperately running for his life and needed medical help. But another, louder part of him knew that the shopping cart had been placed there as a deliberate trap to get him to exit his vehicle. He picked up his phone and called the local police department, explaining the situation and giving them the exact location of the shopping cart and the two men. The dispatcher assured him that they would dispatch a patrol car to investigate the area immediately. When Julian finally pulled into his parents' driveway, he got out of the car to inspect the passenger side, his heart sinking as he turned on his phone's flashlight. The damage was far worse than he had imagined. There was fresh, dark blood smeared across the entire passenger door. It was streaked along the side mirror, rubbed into the door handle, and splattered across the rear panel. There was also a noticeable dent near the center of the door from the sheer force of the man's body hitting the metal. The next morning, Julian's father walked outside, saw the blood and the dent on his prized sports car, and completely lost his temper. He began shouting, accusing Julian of being reckless, driving too fast, and getting into an accident that was going to cost thousands of dollars to repair. Julian tried to explain the terrifying truth of what had happened, but his father was too angry to listen, assuming Julian had probably hit a deer and was making up a wild story to cover it up. It was not until the local police department called their house later that day that his father finally understood. The police had gone out to the country road and found the empty shopping cart, along with signs of a struggle in the dirt nearby. They explained that this was a known, highly dangerous ambush technique used by local criminals. They would place an obstacle like a shopping cart or a fallen branch in the road to force drivers to stop and get out. Once the driver was out of the car, they would assault them, steal their vehicle, and take everything they had. The bloody man who had slammed into Julian's car was likely either high on drugs or had been severely injured while hiding out in the rough fields, which explained his vacant stare and the incredible amount of blood left on the passenger door. If Julian had not reacted as quickly as he did, or if his car doors had been unlocked, he likely would not have survived that night. After that, Julian's father was incredibly apologetic for his initial anger, and he never let Julian take the sports car out for late-night drives again. The physical damage to the car was eventually repaired, but the psychological scars remained. To this day, Julian never stops his vehicle for any obstacle in the road, choosing instead to put his car in reverse and get as far away as possible. These 3 stories serve as a dark, chilling reminder of the dangers that lurk on the empty roads at night. Whether it is a bizarre, unexplained electrical phenomenon in the deep woods, a calculated gang of cargo thieves waiting in the shadows of a desert rest stop, or a violent trap set on a quiet country lane, the highways are not always as peaceful as they seem. When the sun goes down and you are driving alone, you are completely on your own, and your survival might just depend on your instincts and your ability to keep moving. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments, and remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. It was the end of the school year when everything changed. We were in the 7th grade, living in Gatlinburg, Tennessee. If you have ever been to Gatlinburg, you know it is a literal mountain town. There are hills and dense forests as far as your eyes can see. The deep valleys and misty peaks made it feel like a completely different world. It was a place where everyone knew everyone, and we never expected anything bad to happen to us. Our science teacher was a man named Mr. Russo. He was our chaperone for the field trip to Ripley's Aquarium of the Smokies. Mr. Russo was a very laid-back teacher, almost to a fault. While the other teachers were strict with their groups and kept them on a very tight leash, Mr. Russo was just very chill about his job. He did not really pay close attention to what we were doing. At the time, we thought this lack of supervision was the best thing ever. But looking back, his lackadaisical approach to supervising almost cost us our lives. Because Mr. Russo was not really watching, my best friend Aiden and I saw an opportunity to have some fun. The aquarium lobby was packed with students waiting to get inside. We did not want to stand around waiting for all the other groups to slowly move. So we decided to quietly slip away from the lobby, leaving the rest of our class behind. Since our school was the only group there that day, the rest of the aquarium was completely empty. As Aiden and I walked through the quiet, dark blue observation areas, we did not see anyone else. It felt like we had the entire place to ourselves. We got the absolute best views of all the big fish tanks and the incredible habitats. We moved on to the next dark room, which was lit up with a deep blue glow from the tropical fish tanks. We were standing there, laughing and making jokes about the fish. We were pointing out the clownfish and the blue tangs, just like in the movie Finding Nemo. We were completely distracted and having a great time, totally unaware of the danger that was waiting for us in the shadows. And then, suddenly, a very commanding voice cut through the silence. Someone called out to us from the darkness. We turned around and saw a man standing there. He was wearing cargo shorts and a simple green t-shirt. He did not have any visible staff credentials, but he looked like he belonged there. He looked right at us and asked in an assertive voice if we were with the school field trip. I was about to shake my head and say no, because I was worried we would get in trouble for leaving our group. But Aiden spoke up first and said yes. The man told us to come with him right now. Because of how confident he was, both of us assumed he worked for the aquarium and was going to lead us back to our teacher. We did not think twice about it, so we followed him. But the problem was, he was not leading us back toward the main lobby. Instead, he led us through a series of narrow, dark hallways. I remember passing by some public bathrooms and walking under a few exit signs hanging from the ceiling before reaching a heavy exit door. He pushed it open and led us outside into a gravel area right next to the thick woods. I stopped walking and asked the man if he actually worked there and where he was leading us. He insisted that he did, and that he had to drive us around to the front of the aquarium in his car in order to be let back in. We were just nervous 7th graders who thought we were about to get in serious trouble. So we believed him. We willingly got into his back seat. He told us to buckle up and drove out of the back parking lot. Just as we expected him to make a right turn toward the front entrance, he made a sharp left. Both of us asked where he was going. He did not answer, but 5 seconds later, we heard the loud click of the power locks sealing us inside. He reached into his glove box, pulled out a massive knife, and threatened to kill us if we made a move. Aiden and I sat in complete silence, wanting to throw up from the panic. The man kept looking in the rearview mirror every other second, watching our every move. He drove us uphill through a heavily wooded, isolated neighborhood until he finally pulled over onto the side of the road in what appeared to be the middle of nowhere. There were no houses nearby, and there was absolutely no traffic. He told us to stay in the car as he got out with his knife. I whispered to Aiden to be prepared to run as soon as I gave the signal. The man opened my door, popped it open, and told me to step out. He looked at Aiden and said that if he wanted me alive, he better stay in the car. The man started walking me toward the woods. I saw Aiden sliding over to my side. When he was ready, I screamed run. Aiden took off and I easily dodged the man. Escaping his grasp, the man tried chasing us on foot, and he actually threw the knife at me. It missed by only a few inches. I heard the clanging of the knife hitting the ground ahead of me. I did not stop to pick it up. I just kept running downhill in the direction we came. The man stopped following after throwing the knife, got back in his car, and fled. We somehow managed to make it back to the aquarium in under an hour and sneaked back into the group. Mr. Russo did not even notice. Aiden and I decided to keep quiet about what happened. What purpose would it serve getting ourselves in trouble given there was no chance of him getting caught? As we got older, we started to wonder what his intentions were. We could think of a few likely ones, but we try not to think about it. Fast forward to my 8th grade year, when all of my classmates and I looked forward to our Washington, D.C. field trip. The thrill of going on any sort of trip with your friends was enough to excite us. After all the preparations, we were ready. Once we arrived, our class of around 100 students was partitioned off into 3 groups, and we were assigned to our hotel roommates. Each group was sent off in different coach buses, and we would be taken to different attractions throughout D.C. and neighboring states. We visited monuments, parks, and museums. After a long weekend of visiting educational sites, our teachers decided to treat us to a colonial ghost tour one night. It was an evening walking tour through some historical sites, near old village cemeteries and old town homes. The guides told us that many of the empty homes were preserved due to their historical significance. I had always been scared of things related to ghosts, but I was positive that nothing would happen on our tour. We split off into smaller groups of around 10 members each and were instructed to carry around a camera if we wished. The guide kept telling us not to expect much, as there would likely be nothing supernatural during the tour. As we wandered from colonial home to cemetery, I just took interest in the histories the guides shared of each home. My friends were constantly snapping photos to find a shiny orb. My friend Jessica, who I was sharing a room with, was not one of those kids. She would take a photograph every once in a while, but spend most of her time just listening. Our group reached a small 2-story home in the middle of the street. It had an ominous blue hue to the windows, but the house was vacant. I remember being very curious about this home. The tour guide began to tell us a little bit about the house. She mentioned that the home had originally belonged to a man and his beautiful wife. He adored his wife, and the couple was thrilled to receive news that they would be expecting a child. Unfortunately, the wife died after giving birth to a baby girl. The man was absolutely devastated and grew to resent his homely daughter during her childhood. He kept her in the house as much as he could, reminding her about how homely she looked. Feeling she had no other purpose, he had his daughter learn how to sew and weave upstairs, using her only good attribute, which was her hands. Hearing this story made me feel so much sorrow for this girl. She and her father must have lived unhappily in that house until their deaths. Jessica took a photograph of the house, and we both moved on with the group. I kept walking until Jessica stopped and became silent, looking down at her digital camera screen. I walked over and scanned the photograph she had taken. I saw a gleam coming from the edge of the 2nd floor window on the right. I had her zoom in on the scene. After zooming in, you could clearly see 3 figures staring out from the window. On the far right was the translucent outline of a woman. A taller man was standing behind her to the side. Even more curiously, there was a 3rd figure that appeared to be a woman, but she was harder to make out. The body was there for sure, but her skin was not as clear. Jessica and I freaked out. The first woman and man made sense to me as the father and his daughter. But who was this 3rd, dark woman off to the side? I raised my hand and had to ask the guide if there was ever another person that lived with this family at the house. The guide looked surprised by my question and asked why. I told her we saw something in the window. She went quiet, and then she answered that during the time of their residence, they had a black female servant living with them. Jessica and I could not speak for the rest of the night. Senior year of high school, my forensics teacher, Mr. Stevenson, somehow convinced the school to let him take us on a field trip to an abandoned building in the woods. It was the site of a major crime scene. I think he finessed it a bit and made the school think we would just be studying the perimeter and outside of the building, but we did much more than that. Mainly, it used to be a drug den. When we got there, I realized how frighteningly tall the building actually was. Its location was surreal, surrounded by forest in every direction. The only road that leads up to it is a road you would never think to drive down because of the grass growing in the street. Since our current topic at the time of our class was dealing with drugs, Mr. Stevenson led us into the abandoned building. He gave a tour of the place as if he had been there many times before. He seemed to know quite a bit of history about the building, including the fact that the original purpose of the building was completely unknown. Apparently, construction on the higher levels was never finished before it was abandoned. Its location and size made it ideal for drug deals and other illegal activity to take place, which surprised all of us, since there we were inside of this apparent former drug den for a school field trip. Mr. Stevenson was so lax about this trip that he did not even notice when we wandered off. My friend Gianna and I decided to go off on our own too. There had to be at least 8 floors in this building, and we saw from the outside that the top few floors looked unfinished. I basically forced Gianna to come all the way upstairs with me. Worst came to worst, we would just return to the bus outside. We climbed the stairs, flight after flight. As we reached the middle floors, the amount of debris and graffiti lessened a bit. But then as we got to the higher floors, there was even more graffiti and litter. When we reached the second highest floor, everything was still just wood foundation, and a lot of it seemed to be rotting. There were many holes up there, and we had to watch our step. We wanted to go up to the last floor, but the stairs had been completely stripped and broken. There was physically no way to get up. As we navigated the floor, Gianna grabbed my shoulder and stopped me. She pointed up at a hole in the ceiling and whispered that she saw something. Then there was a ticking noise, like the kind of noise a person makes when calling their cat. A second later, a human arm came into view from the hole above us. Only their hand was visible, and they had a long black sleeve on. Gianna was scared, but I laughed a little and called up to them, asking how to get up there. They did not answer. Instead, they just kept making the ticking noise and waving us up. That was when things started getting really creepy, and I agreed with Gianna that we should go back down. Right after I said this, the person pulled their arm out from the hole, and we heard the sound of a shoe quickly scraping the wood foundation above us as they got up. I nudged Gianna to move, wanting to leave. As we were about to leave the room, there was a crash far behind us. We turned and saw a man on the complete opposite side of the room, facing the wall. It seemed he had just jumped through one of the holes in the ceiling. He then quickly turned his head to look at us, without moving his body. There was something about his face and clothing that did not look like the typical urban explorer. He looked dangerous and unstable. Gianna and I ran for it, sprinting down one flight of stairs at a time. 3 flights down, I looked up the long corridor above us and saw the man at the top looking down at me. I yelled at Gianna to go. We kept going down, but 5 flights later I looked up again. There was the man again looking down, but this time he seemed much closer. I realized he had been actively chasing us down the stairs. We finally got to the bottom floor and ran toward the sound of Mr. Stevenson's voice. I let out a nervous laugh out of sheer relief, but Gianna was genuinely traumatized and shaking. We found Mr. Stevenson and told him the truth about what had happened. He was pretty mad at us for wandering off, but when he saw how terrified we were, he agreed we should leave. We got back to the bus, and Mr. Stevenson did a head count 3 times to make sure everyone was safe. We never went back to those woods, and the image of that pale hand waving from the dark ceiling is something that still haunts our dreams to this day. Overall, the other kids did learn things about the building, but for my friend Gianna and me, it was easily the most horrific thing we ever went through in our entire lives. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments, and remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. Imagine graduating from college at 22, standing on the edge of the rest of your life, but having no idea what comes next. That was me a few years ago. I was between jobs, living in a small town, doing odd work like house cleaning, babysitting, and running errands, anything that paid cash. One afternoon, a woman I had dog sat for recommended me to a friend of her neighbor's, a man named Craig. Craig called me to explain he was traveling for a week and needed someone to look after his golden retriever, Max. He said Max was an anxious dog who did best with someone staying overnight. The pay he offered was more than usual, so I agreed. I met Craig 2 days later. He was in his late 40s, tall, wearing wire-rimmed glasses and a windbreaker. He seemed friendly enough, not creepy at all. His house was on the edge of town, tucked back in a wooded area. The place was nice but dated, with beige carpets and floral curtains. Craig walked me through everything, how to let Max out, where the spare key was, and which fridge items to use. He told me to stay in the guest bedroom on the first floor. I started on Monday. The first 2 nights were normal. I watched television, walked Max, and slept in the guest room with him at the foot of the bed. It was the third night when things went wrong. I was sitting on the bed, scrolling through my phone, when I noticed something odd. On the dresser across from the bed was a digital alarm clock. I realized it did not match the rest of the room. It was newer looking, black plastic with a bright blue LED display, in a room that looked like the early 2000s. I do not know what made me look closer. I leaned in and noticed a small, perfectly round black pinhole above the numbers. I realized the tiny hole was pointed directly at the bed. My stomach dropped. I picked it up. It was heavy, and there was a faint buzzing sound inside like a tiny fan. I turned it and stared right into the pinhole. That was when Max suddenly lifted his head and started whining. Then I heard a noise from somewhere else in the house. Not the front door, but deeper inside. I heard the unmistakable sound of a door closing. Every hair on my body stood up. Craig was not supposed to be back until Sunday, and it was only Wednesday night. I froze, holding the clock, my heart pounding so hard it almost hurt. I heard slow footsteps on the hallway carpet. I set the clock down and moved to the door, locking it just as the footsteps stopped outside. Then Craig's voice came through, calm but out of breath. He said he had left something in there and needed me to open the door. I could not speak. A moment later, he said it was not what I thought, claiming it was a motion sensor for the dog, and that he had not wanted to freak me out by mentioning it. I backed away, my hand over my mouth. He told me to come out and talk like adults, but when I did not respond, his knocking turned into violent pounding. He yelled at me to open the door, his voice sharp and angry. Max started barking and jumping at the door, which made Craig sound more agitated. I glanced at the window, which was low enough to climb out, but it was locked. I fumbled with the latch, my hand shaking so badly it took 3 tries to open it. Behind me, Craig was still pounding, shouting that if I did not open the door, he would get the key and call the police to tell them I broke into his house. I did not wait. I shoved the window open, climbed out awkwardly, and dropped onto the grass. Max scrambled after me, his nails clicking on the ledge, but he ultimately gave up and did not jump out. I ran through the yard and down the gravel driveway to the road. I called my mom, who lived 15 minutes away, telling her to come get me. While waiting, I hid behind a cluster of mailboxes. Craig's house was out of sight, but I kept looking over my shoulder. I stayed at my mom's house for the rest of the night. The next morning, I blocked Craig's number and called a lawyer. The lawyer explained that without physical proof, like a recording of the camera or the device itself, pressing charges would be difficult. Even if the clock was a hidden camera, Craig could claim it was a harmless motion sensor. Without evidence, it would be my word against his. I wanted to go back and take a picture of it, but my lawyer strongly advised against returning to the house alone, and the idea of seeing Craig again made my skin crawl, so nothing happened to him. I never got paid for the 3 nights I stayed there. The woman who had recommended me to him stopped responding to my messages, and I never found out if she knew anything about him. For weeks afterward, I had nightmares about waking up to see a camera lens watching me from across the room. I started checking every clock, smoke detector, and picture frame in my own apartment. I still think about that moment I looked into that little black lens, and the sound of the door closing somewhere behind me, in a house I thought was empty. It makes me realize he may have been in the house the entire time, watching me through that camera. Now, as terrifying as it is to think about someone watching you in a house you were hired to look after, it is equally horrifying when it happens in a place you actually paid to stay in. My girlfriend Emma and I booked an Airbnb in late September, a week before we planned to visit her sister in a small town about 3 hours away from where we lived. I picked it because it was cheap, close to her sister's place, had good reviews, and looked cozy in the listing photos. It was an old 2-story house with a wraparound porch, warm yellow lighting, and hardwood floors. There was one small detail in the description that I did not think much of at the time, which was a note telling guests that the basement storage room was off limits. I had stayed in places where the owners kept certain areas locked to store personal belongings, so it barely registered. But when we pulled into the driveway just before sunset on the first evening, the place looked a lot more weathered than in the photos. The house stood completely alone, with only one other house in sight a good distance away, surrounded by dark tree lines and a narrow road leading in. The host, Alan, was waiting for us on the porch before we had even gotten out of the car. He was tall but slightly hunched, in his late 50s, with thin gray hair combed neatly over his head. He was dressed in a perfectly pressed flannel shirt tucked into his jeans. He smiled, but it was the kind of smile that did not quite reach his eyes. His eyes lingered on us just a bit too long when we shook hands. Although his voice was friendly enough, there was a subtle firmness to it when he began showing us around. Alan led us through the front door into a hallway that smelled faintly of dust and something sweet, almost like candle wax. The living room had a big couch facing an old television, and the kitchen looked clean but dated. When we went upstairs, the single bedroom had a large bed under a ceiling fan and a small dresser with a mirror. When we came back down, Alan stopped at a door near the kitchen and tapped a heavy padlock hanging from it. He told us in a commanding tone that this door stayed locked, that it was his storage space, and that there was no reason for us to go down there for anything. He did not smile this time. He just moved on to point out where the extra towels were in the bathroom before wishing us a pleasant stay and heading out. After he left, Emma and I unpacked, made some tea, and sat outside on the porch for a while, listening to the crickets and the rustle of leaves. By the time we got into bed, the quiet was almost unnerving. No traffic, no distant voices, just pure silence. Sometime after midnight, I thought I heard a faint, dull thud from below us. I paused and listened for more, but it did not come again. I told myself it was probably the house settling. The next morning, we got breakfast in town, explored a few shops, and met up with Emma's sister for lunch. We stayed out until just after dark, then went back to the house to make dinner and watch a movie. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up to use the bathroom. As I headed back toward the bedroom, I froze halfway up the stairs when I heard a dragging sound from the basement, like something heavy being pulled across a rough floor. It lasted maybe 5 seconds, stopped, and then started again. My first thought was that maybe Alan had come back for something, but he had told us he would not be around at all during our stay. I stood there listening until it stopped, then went into the bedroom and asked Emma in a whisper if she was awake. She said she was, and that she heard it too. We stayed awake for another half hour, but the sound did not return. The second night was worse. We had spent the day hiking and were exhausted, but sometime around 2:30 in the morning, the noises started again. This was not a dragging sound, but footsteps, 4 or 5 in a row, then a pause, then 3 more. Each pause lasted long enough to make me think that whoever or whatever it was stopping to listen. Emma whispered that she thought she heard breathing between the steps. My heart was pounding, but I did not want to get up and risk making a noise. We just lay there, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling until morning. By the third morning, the atmosphere in the house felt completely different. We still went out and did touristy things, but whenever we came back, it was like a heaviness settled over the rooms. I decided to check the basement door during the day. It was still locked, but when I leaned closer, I thought I could smell something faint and unpleasant, like stale, damp air mixed with a hint of something sour. That night, the noises began even earlier, around midnight. First came a faint metallic clinking, like metal tapping against something hard. Then the footsteps again, going on and off for nearly an hour. Emma barely spoke to me before bed. The fourth night was the breaking point. While getting ready for bed, Emma stopped brushing her hair and asked me if the smoke detector above the bed looked strange. At first, I did not see it, but when I stood on the bed to get a closer look, I saw a small, perfectly round black dot in the middle that was shinier than the surrounding plastic. A bad feeling hit me immediately. I grabbed a chair, unscrewed the detector, and found inside a small battery-operated camera with its green light on. Emma sat on the bed, pale and silent, while I searched the rest of the room and found another small lens poking through a hole in the wall near the dresser mirror, both aimed directly at the bed. That was the end of it. We shoved our stuff into our bags without bothering to fold anything, and we left the house without speaking to the host, driving to the nearest gas station to call the police. 2 officers met us at the gas station. We explained everything, the noises, the cameras, the locked basement, and they followed us back to the house. The front door was unlocked. Technically, we were still allowed in the place as we had paid for 4 days. The police followed us inside and seized all the evidence, including the cameras, the memory cards, and any recording equipment they could find. They also took our statement in detail, asking if any strange events took place during our stay. That was when we mentioned hearing weird noises both nights from the basement. When we showed them the basement door, we were shocked to see that it was now wide open, but it was pitch black down there. We told them that this door was locked before, and that the host was very sketchy about not going down there. The officers went down the stairs to investigate. Moments later, we heard raised voices and a commotion. It quickly became clear what was happening. The officers called us down and asked if this was the host. To our horror, it was Alan. He was hiding in a closet in the basement, where there was a monitor receiving the footage from our bedroom. The police seized this as well. Alan was placed under arrest almost immediately and charged with criminal trespass and invasion of privacy. We did not have to testify in court. The police just sent our statements to the prosecutor. I believe Airbnb basically bribed us with a voucher in hopes that we would not share our bad experience. We took the voucher, but that has not stopped us from telling people about this. We do not trust rentals anymore and just stick to hotels. But sometimes the threat is even closer to home. It is not a stranger who hired you, and it is not an awkward Airbnb host. It is the person you share your rent with. My name is Joe, and this happened about a week ago. I live in a 2-bedroom apartment with my roommate Eric. I did not know him before moving in. We met through a Facebook housing group. He seemed normal enough when we first met to check the place out. He was quiet, polite, and kind of awkward, but not in a bad way. At the time, I thought that would be a good thing because I was not looking for a best friend, just someone responsible enough to help pay rent and not trash the place. For the first couple of months, it was fine. We had opposite work schedules. I worked a regular 9-to-5 office job, and he worked at a warehouse on the late shift. Because of that, I barely saw him. Most of the time when I was leaving in the morning, his door would be shut. At night, when I came home, he was usually gone. We would cross paths once or twice a week, usually just exchanging a few words in the kitchen or living room. It was nothing special, but it worked. Then I started noticing little things in my room that made me feel off. The first time it happened, I came home late and saw that my closet door was open. I usually keep it closed because I do not like seeing my clothes sticking out, but I figured maybe I had left it that way that morning. A few days later, I noticed my desk chair turned slightly toward the bed. I never sit in it that way. Again, I brushed it off and thought maybe I was just not paying attention. Still, it put a strange feeling in my stomach, like somebody had been in my room. One Saturday morning, I was cleaning. I wiped the shelves, dusted, and then started on the window. That is when I saw it. Up in the corner, where the wall met the ceiling, there was a little black dot. I thought it was maybe a screw or a hole in the wall, but when I got closer, I froze. It was a tiny camera, a small wireless camera pointed straight at my bed. My hand shook as I pulled it off the wall. It was not even hidden well, just stuck with a little piece of adhesive. It had a spot for a memory card, but the card was missing. I just stood there holding it, feeling sick. I thought about all the nights I had been in here sleeping, changing clothes, even being intimate with women. The only person who could have put it there was Eric. He was the only other one with access to my room. At that moment, he was not home. His door was closed, and the apartment was quiet. I stood in the hallway staring at his door with my heart pounding. I told myself not to do it, but curiosity won. I slowly turned his doorknob and opened it. His room smelled stale like old food and dirty laundry. The blinds were shut and the room was dark, even though it was the middle of the day. His bed was unmade and his desk was cluttered with papers, unopened mail, and change. I searched around a little, half expecting to find another camera or maybe recordings on his laptop, but there was nothing obvious, just a messy room. I closed the door and went back to my room, but I could not get rid of the uneasiness. I decided to test him. I put the camera in my nightstand drawer under some socks. My plan was simple. If he came looking for it, then I would know for sure it was him who planted it. For 2 nights, nothing happened. I still felt tense, but since there were no signs, I started to think that maybe I was overthinking the whole thing. Then came the 3rd night. I woke up at around 3 in the morning. At first I was not sure why, but then I heard a noise. It was soft like wood sliding against wood. Then I realized it was coming from right beside me, from my nightstand drawer. I opened my eyes a little, pretending to still be asleep. In the faint light coming through the blinds, I saw a figure. It was Eric. He was standing in my room, bent over my nightstand, rummaging through the drawer where I had hidden the camera. I felt my chest tighten, and my heart beat so loud I was sure he could hear it. I stayed still, not knowing what to do, and then he stopped. He froze and just stood there completely still. Slowly he turned his head toward my bed. He was looking straight at me. For a moment I thought maybe he was not sure if I was awake, but then he spoke. He said he knew I was awake. I felt ice run down my spine as he said that. Then he asked me what I had done with it. I sat up quickly, my fear turning to anger. I demanded to know why he put a camera in my room. He stared at me and told me it was because he thought I was stealing from him. I told him that was ridiculous, that it made no sense. I said he had aimed the camera at my bed, and that it was one of the sickest things I had ever seen. He tried to tell me he only wanted proof, but I did not buy it. I told him he was lying and that he had been spying on me. We started yelling at each other. He kept repeating that I was overreacting. I told him I was going to report him to the landlord and maybe even the police. My voice was shaking with both fear and rage. Finally, I yanked open the drawer, grabbed the camera, and held it up. I told him that this was proof, and that he was never getting it back. I stormed out of my room, walked into the kitchen, and threw the camera straight into the garbage, thinking I broke it. I told him to stay out of my room, and that the next day I would be telling the landlord everything. Eric stood in the hallway with his fists clenched, and he was just staring at me with a blank expression. Then he turned and walked back into his room without another word. I did not sleep the rest of that night. I sat on the couch with the television on, too afraid he might come back into my room. Every little sound in the apartment made me jump. When the sun finally came up, I checked the garbage can. The camera was gone. That was a week ago. I told the landlord what happened. He said he would look into it, but so far nothing has been done. Eric still lives here. We do not speak, but the way he looks at me when we pass each other makes my skin crawl. It is like he is waiting for me to say or do something. I do not know why he really put the camera in my room. His excuse about me stealing was an obvious lie. I do not know what he wanted to record, or what he was planning to do with it. And honestly, I do not want to know. But every night when I lay down in bed, I cannot shake the feeling that there are more cameras hidden around me. Maybe in places I would not think to check. I scoured the entire room and could not find any, but still, the thought does linger in my mind. Last night I was awake late and heard footsteps come down the hallway and then stop right outside my door. For over a minute, there was silence except for slight cracks in the wood floor outside my door from the pressure of him standing there. He stood there like a creep for a couple of minutes until I finally heard his footsteps move away from the door. I am looking into moving out. I am currently searching for a new apartment every single day because I cannot stay here much longer. I am also trying to figure out if pressing charges for invasion of privacy or something is feasible, considering I did not even think to take a picture of the camera or record the confrontation. I do not even have any texts from him admitting to placing the camera there. I have got literally nothing. But anyway, wish me luck in this situation, because I am not sure what the outcome will be. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Back in the early days of the internet, websites like Craigslist felt like a digital Wild West. It was unregulated, making it a perfect hunting ground for predators. This is the story of 3 different people who logged onto their computers, looking for a simple transaction. only to find themselves staring straight into the eyes of absolute monsters. Our first story begins with a 28-year-old man who was in a lonely place in his life. He decided to browse Craigslist personal ads for casual encounters. Most postings seemed fake, except for one featuring a cute brunette. The ad stated she was 26, named Jenny, and wanted a quick hookup with no strings attached. She left her phone number, so he texted her. He noticed the message bubble turned blue, showing she had an iPhone. She typed back instantly, telling him to call her Jenny. They flirted briefly until she sent him her address. He grabbed his keys, feeling a mix of excitement and embarrassment. He drove into a rundown area and turned onto a dark, dead-end street. Feeling uneasy, he texted her to ask which house was hers. She replied that she lived at number 209, the last house on the block. He pulled up, and the dim porch light revealed the numbers. The house was in terrible shape, surrounded by weeds, and looked abandoned. He walked up and knocked, but there was no answer. Suddenly, his phone vibrated with a text from Jenny, telling him to come around to the backyard. He typed back, asking why. The typing indicator appeared, then vanished. Against his better judgment, he unlatched the side gate and stepped into the pitch-black backyard. Feeling an overwhelming sense of dread, he looked up at the dark house, and his heart skipped a beat. Through a window, he saw a figure staring straight down at him. The moment they realized he saw them, they quickly backed away and closed the blinds. His phone vibrated with a text from Jenny saying she would be right out. He was shaking. Suddenly, he heard a dry branch snap near a wooden shed. He turned on his phone flashlight and aimed it toward the noise. His heart stopped. He saw what looked exactly like a human arm quickly moving behind the shed. He shut off the light and walked as fast as possible back to his car. He jumped in, but before he could shut the door, a window flew open. A woman with a deranged voice screamed into the night, telling him not to leave. He started the engine, threw the car in drive, and slammed on the gas. As he pulled away, the front door burst open and he heard a loud pop. He floored it and drove as fast as he could. 5 blocks away, his tire went flat. They had shot his tire. He drove on the flat rim before stopping to call for roadside assistance. The repairman actually found the bullet lodged deep inside the rubber. Later on, 3 people were arrested at that house. 1 dirty-looking woman and 2 redneck men. They went to trial and were found guilty. They were too stupid to even leave the house after pulling such a dangerous stunt. Our second story involves a young man whose mother and stepdad were ranchers. They bought a new truck and listed their old one online. A woman living 4 hours away was highly interested but made countless excuses as to why she could not drive down. The stepdad was kind to a fault, so he convinced his wife to follow him in a second vehicle that Saturday, so he could deliver the truck to her. The mother was suspicious, and her fears were confirmed when they arrived. The lady gave a convoluted story about bank problems and presented a post-dated check. She also begged to keep the plates in his name. The mother refused the plates but lost the argument over the check. They drove home, and as expected, the check bounced. The woman dodged their calls, eventually claiming she was in the hospital. The stepdad stood his ground and told her they would be taking the truck back. They drove back with a flatbed trailer. Nobody answered the door, so they found the truck in a shed and loaded it. While the stepdad secured the load, the mother wrote a sarcastic note thanking her for nothing and slipped it under the door. 15 minutes later, as they drove home, the lady called, screaming that she knew where they lived and they had made a huge mistake. 2 days later, the stepdad awoke to the sound of someone climbing through his bedroom window. The young man was awakened by his mother's chilling screams. The crazed woman had broken in, armed with a knife. Somehow, the stepdad managed to tackle her even though she was armed. They held her down and called the police, who took her away. It was a terrifying reminder of how far some people will go when they feel slighted, and it showed that karma has a strange way of catching up to people. Our final story takes us all the way back to the year 2002, during the very early days of Craigslist. Back then, the website was a very different place. It was mostly used like an online garage sale where regular people listed old items they did not need anymore. A father and his 11-year-old son were living in a quiet suburban neighborhood. They lived in a nice cul-de-sac, and they were dying to buy a hockey net so they could practice playing hockey together in the street. One afternoon, the father was browsing through Craigslist and spotted an ad for a slightly used, regulation-sized hockey goal for only $50. To make the deal even sweeter, the seller was throwing in a hockey puck and 2 slightly used hockey sticks. The father was incredibly excited. He called the phone number listed on the ad. A man answered with a very deep, flat, and almost emotionless voice. Because the seller lived about 2 hours away, he suggested they meet halfway to make things easier. He explained that he would put the hockey gear in the back of his pickup truck and meet them. However, he mentioned that he could only make the drive after he got off from his work shift, which meant they would have to meet late at night. Long after the sun had gone down, the father agreed, and they decided to meet at a public rest stop right off the highway. The father decided to take his wife's minivan, since it was the only vehicle they owned that could actually fit a giant hockey goal. He also decided to bring his 11-year-old son along for the ride. Within about an hour of driving, they arrived at the highway rest stop. The entire area was completely empty at that hour, but it was well lit by 3 massive light posts. The father pulled the minivan directly under one of the bright lights, put the car in park, and waited. Right on time, a pickup truck pulled off the highway and rolled into the parking lot. The driver stopped his truck directly in front of the minivan. The father stepped out of his vehicle and walked up to the driver's side window. But as he approached, his eyes darted to the back of the pickup truck. It was completely empty. There was no hockey net, no sticks, and no puck. The driver rolled down his window and asked if he was Steve. The father confirmed his name. The driver then told him that his buddy was driving a second truck and was bringing all the hockey equipment. The driver then pulled his truck behind the minivan, parked, and shut off his headlights. Instantly, the father got a terrible feeling in his gut. He turned around, rushed back to the minivan, and told his young son to get back inside and lock every single door except for the driver's door. Just as he said that, 2 more pairs of headlights appeared from the highway and pulled into the rest stop. The 2 trucks parked right next to the minivan, boxing them in. The father looked at the beds of both trucks, and as he feared, there was absolutely no hockey equipment in either of them. His heart began to race with pure panic. He was not worried about himself, but he was absolutely terrified for his young son. A group of large, heavily built, and muscular men stepped out of the trucks. They walked over and surrounded the father, staring him down in an attempt to intimidate him. A bald man wearing sunglasses stepped forward and demanded to know where the money was. The father did not hesitate. He pulled out his wallet, handed it over, and begged them to just take the cash and let them go. The bald man pulled out about $100 from the wallet, but he was furious because he was expecting a lot more. He turned to 2 of his men and ordered them to grab the boy from the minivan. The father began to scream and plead with them, begging them not to touch his son. One of the men grabbed a heavy object and smashed the glass of the minivan's back window. The father could hear the horrific, heartbreaking screams of his young son trapped inside the car. But right at that exact moment, what can only be described as an absolute miracle occurred. A vehicle pulled off the highway and entered the dark parking lot. All of the men stopped what they were doing and turned to look at the headlights. As the vehicle got closer, the father felt a wave of pure relief wash over him. It was a police car. The officer immediately activated the flashing red and blue lights as soon as he saw the chaotic scene. Within seconds, the group of men scrambled back into their pickup trucks and took off down the highway. 2 of the trucks managed to speed away, but the police officer blocked the path of the 3rd truck, capturing the suspects immediately. Backup units arrived shortly after. The father explained the entire terrifying ordeal to the officers. Surprisingly, the men who were caught quickly ratted out the others, showing they had absolutely no loyalty to their group. The police even provided a full escort to guide the father and his son back to their home. While they survived the terrifying night, the father became far more protective of his family and extremely cautious about ever meeting strangers online again. It turns out that Craigslist, while a convenient tool for many, can easily be manipulated by those who wish to do harm. Whether it is a quick setup in a dark backyard, a dispute over a ranch truck, or a coordinated ambush at a deserted highway rest stop, danger can hide behind any anonymous advertisement. It is a sobering reminder that we must always trust our instincts when something feels off, because that small gut feeling might be the only thing keeping us safe. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. The holidays are supposed to be a time for family, warmth, and good food. But sometimes, they turn into a backdrop for the kind of fear you never really shake off. Let us start with a trip that took place on a Thanksgiving a few years ago. I was on my way to my girlfriend's parents' house. I had been invited to their Thanksgiving dinner, which was a huge honor for me. At that point, I had only met her parents 3 times, so I was incredibly nervous. To make things even more stressful, her grandparents, aunts, and uncles were also going to be there, and I had never met any of them. We had a long drive ahead of us, lasting about an hour. About 45 minutes into the drive, my gas gauge was getting low, so we had to stop. We pulled up to a dead Gulf station right off the highway. It was quiet, dark, and felt completely isolated. I decided to fill up with premium for once, just to do my car a favor. Knowing it was cheaper to pay with cash, I grabbed my wallet and walked inside the station. My head was down as I dug my hand inside my wallet, searching for a $10 and a $20 bill. When I finally pulled the bills out, I instinctively looked up and said, 30 on 2, but I stopped mid-sentence. There was absolutely no one behind the register. I looked around, searching for a bell on the counter, but there was none. I simply called out, "Is anyone there?" There was no answer. The strange part was that there was not even a back door behind the counter. Usually, you would assume a door there would lead to an employees only room, but it was just a solid wall. The only other door in this entire little gas station was a single bathroom, and that door was wide open, exposing nothing but complete blackness from within. I figured maybe whoever was manning the register had just gone outside for a quick second. So, I walked back outside and shrugged my shoulders at my girlfriend, who was sitting in the car. I looked around the property, thinking there might be an ice machine or a portable toilet, distracting a potential cashier. But there was nothing. It was a relatively small station surrounded by dense woods in almost all directions. I went behind the building to check by the dumpster under a dimly lit roof light, but there was nobody there. I decided I would just pay with my credit card at the pump instead. But as I turned around, someone from out in the dark woods called over to me in a kind of whispery, raspy yell, "Hey, hey!" It kept coming from deep within the trees. I took out my phone and flipped on the flashlight to skim the outer tree line. The beam of light momentarily revealed someone standing behind a tree, watching me. I took off running back to the car, hopped inside, and immediately stepped on the gas to get out of there. My girlfriend was scared out of her mind. As we sped down the highway, I told her about the bizarre and terrifying thing that had just happened, and she kept looking through the rearview mirrors to make sure we were not being followed. We pulled up to the next gas station we could find. This one actually had a cashier working inside. I paid him $30 and went back outside to fill up my tank. But a large van pulled up right behind mine, and a man wearing a cap stepped out, staring intently at me. I tried to act as if I did not notice him, but he kept staring for at least 20 seconds. I looked at him and asked if there was a problem. He finally turned away. We made it to her parents' house safely. But a few weeks later, I found out that a 33-year-old Indian man who worked at that first gas station had been murdered. His body had been stuffed in the woods right behind the station, around the exact time we were there. I immediately gave the police a tip about the strange man at the second station, who was surely caught on camera. The following year on Thanksgiving, a similar murder happened at another gas station. We nicknamed him the Thanksgiving Killer, and he has still not been caught. Let us move on to the next story. It is a well-known fact that Walmart attracts some of the absolute weirdest and most unpredictable people, especially during major shopping events like Black Friday. My brothers and I had decided to go video game shopping to see if we could score some good deals. Our first and only stop for the night was the local Walmart. The place was absolutely mobbed when we arrived. And being Walmart on Black Friday, it was crowded with the absolute worst kinds of people. There were rude, strange, and downright creepy individuals everywhere, all pushing and shoving, just to save a few bucks on already cheap products. My brothers and I went upstairs to the video game section. Personally, I was looking for the latest Call of Duty game, while my brothers were looking for a different game that I cannot quite remember now. We were standing by the display cases, browsing through the titles, when out of nowhere, a heavy older man walked right up to me. He smelled strongly of vomit, and his physical appearance was incredibly disheveled. He looked at me and said, "You like video games, huh?" I was instantly uncomfortable. I answered with a short yeah and began to slowly slide away. But the man did not take the hint. Instead, he took a step closer and said, "My son likes video games too. Maybe you should come over to our house and play some games with him. He really craves company." As he said this, he gave me a deeply unsettling, creepy smile. I panicked a little and tried to think of an excuse to get away. I told him, "Oh no, I am not from around town, sorry." That was the only lie I could come up with on the spot. I did not want to give him a single chance to keep the conversation going. I simply gave him a quick smile, called out my brother's name, and walked away to make it seem like I was distracted by something else. Before I rounded the corner, I did a quick glance backward. The man was still standing in the exact same spot, just staring at me as I walked away. I made it to the next aisle over, and immediately felt a sense of comfort being next to my brothers again. I waited around with them until they finally found the game they wanted, and then we all headed down to the checkout counters. The lines were absolutely insane. I knew it would probably take at least 10 to 15 minutes just to make it to the front of the line to pay. Since my brothers were holding our spot, I took that opportunity to wander off and check out some of the clothing sales, specifically looking at some cheap jeans and t-shirts nearby. At one point during my browsing, I found myself in what was probably the most secluded and quiet corner of the entire clothing department. I was looking through a rack of t-shirts when suddenly, someone reached out and grabbed my arm incredibly hard. My immediate reaction was that it was one of my brothers playing a joke and messing with me. I turned around quickly, fully prepared to tell him to back off. But it was not my brother. It was the same creepy man from the video game section. I started panicking. I began calling out for help, screaming as loud as I could that I did not know this man and that he needed to let go of me. A few shoppers nearby walked over and just stared at us, but nobody actually did anything to help or intervene. Fortunately, the commotion was enough to scare the man. He let go of my arm and quickly walked away, disappearing into the crowd. I stood there shaking. I had no idea what he was thinking or what he was planning to do to me in such a public place. I decided not to tell my brothers what had happened out of sheer embarrassment and confusion, but they easily picked up on the fact that I was extremely quiet and distant afterward. When they asked me what was wrong, I just kept telling them it was nothing. We paid for our items and walked out to the parking lot. We got into my brother's Chevrolet Camaro. As soon as I sat down in the passenger seat, I looked out the window toward the main entrance of the Walmart, and there he was. The creepy man was sitting on a concrete bench right outside the doors, facing directly toward our car. As we started driving out of the parking lot, our exit route forced us to pass right in front of the store entrance. I got one last look at him. His head moved ever so slightly, tracking my exact position through the car window as we drove by. I gave him the finger, but he just kept staring. That was the last time I ever saw him. Let us move on to the third story, which took place during Black Friday in the year 2013. I decided to get up at 3 in the morning to catch holiday deals at Home Depot. They were having crazy deals on artificial Christmas trees, and I wanted to get one for my family. I found a nice 9-foot tree for half off, and an employee helped me carry the box to my car. The parking lot was empty. I tipped the employee and got in my car. Suddenly, a tall young man in a black beanie knocked on my window asking for change. My console was empty, so I told him I did not have anything. He looked disappointed and asked if I could give him a lift to the nearest gas station. Even though I was nervous, I decided to let him in. He did not say thank you. I put the car in drive and asked if he knew of any gas stations. He just muttered, "Nah." When I asked why he needed to go to a gas station, he completely ignored me. I felt extremely uncomfortable as I drove, and I could tell he was staring intensely at me the entire time. I finally saw a gas station, but the light turned red. I decided to summon up the courage to look at him, and his cold, emotionless stare ran straight through me. I asked if he was okay, and he ever so slightly nodded. When the light turned green, I pulled into the gas station. He got out and stood on the sidewalk, watching me as I drove away. I quickly realized my phone was missing from the cup holder. I drove back, but he was gone. My phone had all my personal info on it. The next night, after returning from our delayed Thanksgiving dinner, I found my front door open and my entire house trashed. I called the police from a neighbor's phone. They found fingerprints everywhere, but they did not match anyone on record, leaving us with the terrifying reality of an unidentified predator knowing exactly where we live. Now, let us move on to the final story. This one also took place on Thanksgiving. I was hosting a holiday dinner at my house with my family and our next-door neighbors, Tom and his wife. After we all finished eating, the adults sat in the living room to watch the football game, except for my daughters Tracy and Michelle, who were 16 and 13. During halftime, I went upstairs to Michelle's room to convince her to come down and join us. A bit later, Tom and I went outside to smoke. Tom mentioned that his teenage son Sam had decided to go back to their house next door to watch some movies, joking that he was probably watching adult videos. As we talked, I looked up at the window of Michelle's bedroom. I froze. There was a silhouette of someone standing in the dark, looking straight out of her window down at us. Knowing it was not Michelle, I quickly ran inside and went up to her room. Michelle followed me. The room was empty. I asked if anyone had been in here, and she said no. We went back downstairs, but as the game restarted, we heard a sudden, faint thud from upstairs. I ran back up, with Michelle behind me. I turned on the lights and noticed the sliding closet door was cracked open. I squinted past the shadows, and my blood ran cold. I was looking directly at a human eye staring back at me through the crack. I let out a loud scream, and Michelle started screaming too. Relatives rushed up the stairs as I violently slid the closet door open and dragged Sam out by his neck. He was clutching several private, personal belongings of my 13-year-old daughter. Tom ran in and found me holding his son. That incident completely ruined my friendship with Tom and his wife, and we never spoke again. It made me incredibly protective over my daughters, realizing that sometimes the biggest threats do not come from strangers, but from the people living right next door. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.